In the quiet, frost-kissed countryside of Pinewood, Minnesota, an extraordinary bond between man and nature unfolds. George Whitaker, a retired farmer with a heart as vast as the land he once tended, has dedicated his life to the care of wildlife. His most cherished companion is Luna, a young bobcat he rescued as a fragile kit after tragedy struck her in the wild. For 18 months, Luna has thrived under George's watchful eye, her enclosure a sanctuary where the line between wild and tame blurs. But one icy December morning, everything changes. When George discovers Luna's enclosure broken into and the bobcat gone, a desperate search begins, one that will test the limits of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the wild creature he calls family. This is a story of courage, community, and the enduring power of compassion in the face of cruelty. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The morning frost clung to the tall grass surrounding George Whitaker's farmhouse like a delicate silver blanket. At 68 years old, George had grown accustomed to rising before dawn, a habit ingrained from decades of tending to his family's farm in the rural outskirts of Pinewood, Minnesota. Though he had officially retired 3 years ago, selling most of his land to younger farmers from the community, he still maintained a modest property that backed up against the dense northern forests. On this particular December morning, George's weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee as he made his way to the converted barn at the edge of his property. Inside, a specialized enclosure housed his most treasured companion, Luna, a young female bobcat he had rescued 18 months earlier. "Good morning, little lady," George called out in his gravelly voice as he approached the secure habitat he had meticulously designed with the help of local wildlife experts. But the familiar chirping response that usually greeted him was absent. George quickened his pace, his heart beginning to race as he reached the enclosure door. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the concrete floor when he discovered the lock had been broken and the door left partially open.
"Luna!"
His voice echoed through the empty space. The specialized heating lamps still hummed, keeping the space at the perfect temperature for the wildcat. The carefully arranged branches and hiding spots remained undisturbed. But Luna was gone. George's hands trembled as he reached for his cell phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "This is an emergency," he told the dispatcher, his voice cracking. "Someone's broken into my property and stolen my bobcat." Sheriff David Reynolds had served Pinewood County for nearly 20 years. At 55, he had seen his fair share of unusual cases in this close-knit community where the wilderness often intersected with human habitation. But a stolen bobcat was certainly a first. "Run me through this again, George," Sheriff Reynolds said, notepad in hand as he stood in front of the empty enclosure. Two deputy sheriffs carefully dusted the broken lock for fingerprints while a third took photographs of distinctive boot prints in the soft earth outside the barn. George's eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Luna isn't like other bobcats. Her mother was killed by a logging truck last spring when Luna was just a tiny kid. The wildlife rangers brought her to me because I've worked with rehabilitating wildlife for years. But Luna was too young, too imprinted on humans to ever be released back into the wild." "And you have permits for keeping her?" Sheriff Reynolds asked, already knowing the answer but needing to follow protocol. George nodded, leading the sheriff back to his house where he produced a thick folder of documentation. "Everything's legal and above board. I work closely with the Department of Natural Resources. Luna has regular checkups with Dr. Martinez at the wildlife clinic. She's microchipped, properly housed. She's family, David." Sheriff Reynolds recognized the raw pain in the old farmer's voice. In small communities like theirs, pets were more than just animals. They were vital companions, especially for people like George who lived alone after his wife Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier. "We'll find her, George," the sheriff promised, though he knew it wasn't a guarantee he could make. Wild animal theft was rare, but not unheard of. There was an unfortunate black market for exotic pets, and bobcats, with their spotted fur and wild mystique, could fetch a high price from unscrupulous buyers. As if reading his thoughts, George's face hardened. If someone took her to sell her, they don't understand what they've done. Luna isn't fully wild, but she's not a house cat either. She trusts me, but she's still a wild animal. If they mishandle her..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Sheriff Reynolds placed a reassuring hand on the older man's shoulder. "We've got good leads already with those boot prints, and I'm putting out an alert to all neighboring counties. Someone will have seen something." The breakthrough came faster than anyone expected. By that afternoon, Deputy Lisa Morales had traced the distinctive boot prints to a pair of custom hunting boots sold exclusively at a sporting goods store in the neighboring county. Only 6 pairs had been sold in the past year, and one of the buyers, Travis Schultz, had a record of prior arrests for poaching and selling illegal animal products. A judge quickly signed a search warrant, and by nightfall, Sheriff Reynolds and his team surrounded a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of the next county. Inside, they found Travis Schultz and his cousin, Darren, along with cages containing several exotic reptiles and birds, clearly part of a small-time wildlife trafficking operation. Luna, however, was nowhere to be found. "Where's the bobcat?" Sheriff Reynolds demanded as he handcuffed Travis, who struggled against the restraints. "Don't know what you're talking about," Travis spat, but his cousin Darren, younger and clearly frightened by the police presence, broke immediately. "We didn't know what to do with it," Darren blurted out, earning a venomous glare from Travis. "It wasn't like the other animals. It kept hissing and trying to claw us. We couldn't control it, couldn't sell it in that state." "Where is she now?" Deputy Morales pressed, taking a step closer to Darren, who shrank back against the wall. "We drove out to Blackwater Marsh last night and let it go," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was Travis's idea. He said it would survive on its own, that it was a wild animal anyway." Sheriff Reynolds felt his blood run cold. Blackwater Marsh was a treacherous area even in good weather, a sprawling wetland with patches of quicksand-like mud and freezing pools that could trap the unwary. And with the recent temperature drop, "You abandoned a partially domesticated bobcat in Blackwater Marsh in below-freezing temperatures," he clarified, his normally calm demeanor slipping. Travis shrugged, seemingly unconcerned. "Not our problem anymore." Sheriff Reynolds fought the urge to let his anger show as he turned to Deputy Morales. "Call search and rescue. Then contact Dr. Martinez at the wildlife clinic. Tell her we need her expertise and emergency supplies. And get George on the phone. He knows Luna better than anyone." Turning back to the Schultz cousins, he added, "You two just added animal cruelty to your charges. And if that bobcat doesn't survive, I'll personally make sure the judge hears every detail of what you've done." Blackwater Marsh stretched across nearly 1,000 acres of wilderness, a labyrinthine expanse of bog, dense underbrush, and skeletal trees whose bare branches clawed at the darkening sky. By the time the search party assembled, the winter sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of deep orange and crimson. George insisted on joining the search despite Sheriff Reynolds' concerns about the difficult terrain and the older man's age. "I'm not sitting at home while Luna's out there," George stated firmly as he pulled on insulated waders and a heavy coat. "She knows my voice. She'll respond to me if she can." The sheriff couldn't argue with that logic. They divided into 4 teams, each equipped with powerful spotlights, rescue equipment, and radios. Dr. Elena Martinez, the wildlife veterinarian who had cared for Luna since her rescue, accompanied George's team, carrying a specialized medical kit designed for emergency treatment of hypothermia and injuries. "How long can she survive out here?" George asked Dr. Martinez as they carefully picked their way along a relatively solid path through the marsh, their lights sweeping across the landscape. Dr. Martinez's expression was grave behind her fogged glasses. Bobcats are naturally resilient, but Luna's different. She's been in a temperature-controlled environment since she was very young. She hasn't developed the thick winter coat wild bobcats would have by now. And without hunting skills, she let the sentence hang unfinished. George nodded grimly, understanding what wasn't being said. Luna had been raised with prepared meals, never learning to hunt effectively. Between the cold, the treacherous terrain, and her lack of survival skills, every minute counted. "Luna," George called out, his voice carrying across the silent marsh.
"Luna, girl, where are you?"
The search continued for hours, the temperature dropping steadily as night fully descended. Radios crackled with updates from the other teams. No sign of the bobcat, though they had discovered several places where something had disturbed the underbrush, possibly indicating Luna's path. It was past midnight when George's flashlight caught a flash of movement near a partially frozen pond about 50 yards ahead. "There," he shouted, pointing toward the disturbance. "I saw something move." Dr. Martinez grabbed his arm as he started forward. "Careful, George. The ground isn't stable here." Taking a more cautious approach, they circled around, using fallen logs and tussocks of firmer ground to make their way closer. As they approached, George's light illuminated a heartbreaking sight. Luna was there, but she was in grave danger. The young bobcat had ventured onto what appeared to be solid ground, but was actually a thin crust covering a deep mud pit. She had broken through and was now trapped, her lower body submerged in the freezing muck, her front paws desperately clawing at the surrounding ice as she fought to keep her head above the surface.
"Luna!"
George cried out, his voice breaking. The bobcat's ears perked up at the familiar sound, and she let out a weak chirping call that tore at George's heart. "She's still alive," Dr. Martinez whispered, quickly assessing the situation. "But she's hypothermic and exhausted. We need to get her out immediately, but we can't just rush in or we'll end up trapped too." Sheriff Reynolds, who had joined their group after hearing their radio discovery, immediately took charge. "I've seen rescues like this before. We need to distribute our weight and create a bridge to reach her." Working with practiced efficiency, the team cut branches from nearby trees and laid them across the treacherous surface, creating a makeshift pathway. George watched with agonizing helplessness as Luna's struggles grew weaker, her normally bright eyes dulling with fatigue. "Hold on, little lady," he called to her. "We're coming. Just hold on." When the path was secure enough, Dr. Martinez carefully made her way out to where Luna was trapped, the others holding safety ropes attached to her harness. With gentle, expert movements, she secured a specialized animal rescue harness around Luna's upper body, taking care not to further stress the weakened bobcat. "She knows me," George insisted, making his way carefully along the branch bridge despite the protests of the others. "Let me help, please." Perhaps it was the desperation in his voice, or perhaps Sheriff Reynolds recognized that in this moment, protocol was less important than the bond between man and animal. Whatever the reason, he nodded his permission, and George slowly approached. "Hey there, little lady," George murmured as he reached Luna's side. "What a mess you've gotten yourself into, huh?" At the sound of his voice, Luna's eyes focused slightly, and she made a feeble attempt to reach toward him, a gesture that brought tears to George's eyes. Working together, George and Dr. Martinez began the delicate process of extracting Luna from the mud. The suction was strong, and each careful pull seemed to drain what little energy Luna had left. "We're losing her," Dr. Martinez warned as Luna's eyes began to close, her breathing becoming shallow. In that moment, George made a decision born of love rather than logic. Ignoring the shouts from the shore, he lowered himself deeper onto the unstable surface and slipped his arms under Luna's body. "I've got you," he whispered to the bobcat. "I promised I'd always keep you safe, remember?" With a strength that belied his age, George lifted, fighting against the grip of the mud. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a wet sucking sound, Luna's lower body came free. The sudden release threw George off balance, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed he might fall face-first into the mire. But strong hands grabbed him from behind. Sheriff Reynolds had moved out onto the branches despite the risk, reaching George just in time. "I've got you both," the sheriff assured him, his steady grip anchoring them. "Now let's get back to solid ground." Together, they carefully retreated from the treacherous bog, Dr. Martinez moving ahead to prepare emergency treatment. Once they reached shore, George cradled Luna's mud-covered, shivering body close to his chest, unwilling to let go even as Dr. Martinez worked to assess her condition. "She's severely hypothermic," the vet announced, quickly wrapping Luna in specialized thermal blankets. "Her heartbeat is weak but stable. We need to get her to the clinic immediately." The journey back through the marsh was a blur to George, his focus entirely on the precious bundle he carried. Luna remained unervingly still, occasionally making small sounds of distress that pierced George's heart like physical pain. By the time they reached the vehicles, a makeshift warming station had been set up in the back of Dr. Martinez's veterinary truck, and Fourline delivered warm fluids to Luna's dehydrated body, while heating pads carefully raised her core temperature. "Will she make it?" George asked, his voice barely audible as he watched Dr. Martinez work. The veterinarian's face was tense with concentration. "The next few hours will be critical. But she's young, and she was healthy before this. And she has something many animals in her condition don't have." "What's that?" George asked. Dr. Martinez looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his. "She has you, George. Animals know when they're loved. Sometimes, that makes all the difference." The waiting room of the Pinewood Wildlife Clinic had never felt so small to George as it did during those long, uncertain hours. Sheriff Reynolds stayed for as long as he could, leaving only when called away to process the arrests of Travis and Darren Schultz, promising to return as soon as possible. Word spread quickly through the close-knit community, and by morning, the waiting room had filled with people bringing coffee, homemade food, and quiet words of support. Farmers who had known George for decades sat silently beside him. Local school teachers who had arranged field trips to see Luna's enclosure, part of George's wildlife education program, brought cards made by their students. Even Mrs. Abernathy, the town librarian who was famously afraid of anything with claws, arrived with a thermos of hot soup and a firm declaration that those horrible men should be locked up and the key thrown away. Shortly before noon, Dr. Martinez emerged from the treatment area, looking exhausted but with a cautious smile on her face. "She's stabilized," she announced, and a collective sigh of relief passed through the gathered crowd. "Her body temperature is back to normal, and we've treated her for exposure and minor injuries. She's still weak, but she's alert and responsive." "Can I see her?" George asked, already rising from his chair. Dr. Martinez nodded. "She's been asking for you, in her own way. Just for a few minutes, though. She needs rest." In the recovery room, Luna lay on a specialized heating pad, her normally sleek fur still matted in places despite the careful cleaning the staff had performed. Various monitors beeped softly, tracking her vital signs. Her eyes, those intelligent, golden eyes that had captured George's heart from the moment he first saw her, opened as he approached. "There's my girl," George whispered, carefully reaching out to stroke the top of her head with one finger. Their special greeting that Luna had accepted since she was a tiny kid. To everyone's surprise, Luna responded with more energy than seemed possible given her condition. She lifted her head, making the chirping sound that George had come to recognize as her way of saying hello, then weakly butted her head against his hand, seeking more contact. "I think she's telling you she's ready to go home," Dr. Martinez said, watching the interaction with professional interest and personal emotion. "Though not quite yet, of course." George nodded, understanding. "We'll get your palace all fixed up, little lady," he promised Luna. "No one's going to take you away again." The next few days brought a flurry of activity to George's quiet farm. Community members rallied together to repair and upgrade Luna's enclosure, installing a state-of-the-art security system donated by a local business. The county wildlife department, impressed by the community's response, fast-tracked approval for George to expand his wildlife rehabilitation efforts. Meanwhile, the legal system moved with surprising speed. The evidence against the Schultz cousins was overwhelming, and facing multiple federal charges related to wildlife trafficking, they agreed to a plea deal that would put them behind bars for several years. Sheriff Reynolds personally delivered the news to George, finding the older man busy checking the newly reinforced locks on Luna's enclosure. "Justice works sometimes," the sheriff commented as he explained the plea deal. George nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not sure I care about punishment as much as I care about prevention. Will this stop others from doing the same thing?" "It sends a message," Sheriff Reynolds replied. "And your story is doing even more." The county commissioners are talking about increasing funding for wildlife protection and education. People care, George. Sometimes they just need a reminder of why they should. For days after her rescue, Luna was deemed strong enough to return home. The journey from the clinic to George's farm became an impromptu parade, with well-wishers lining the route. Dr. Martinez personally supervised Luna's transfer, ensuring the Bobcat remained calm in her specialized carrier. Back at the enclosure, now reinforced and secured with new locks and monitoring equipment, George sat patiently on the floor as Dr. Martinez opened the carrier door. For a long moment, Luna remained inside, surveying her familiar surroundings with cautious eyes. "It's okay," George encouraged softly. "You're home now, little lady. You're safe." Slowly, hesitantly, Luna emerged. She inspected the space methodically, revisiting her favorite perches and hiding spots, as if confirming everything was as she remembered. Finally, she approached George, circling him twice before coming to rest against his side, her body language relaxing for the first time since her ordeal began. Dr. Martinez smiled at the sight. "I'd say that's a successful homecoming." Over the following weeks, Luna's recovery progressed steadily. Her physical wounds healed quickly, though George noticed subtle changes in her behavior. A new wariness of unfamiliar sounds, a tendency to stay closer to her sheltered areas when visitors came to the educational presentations that George had resumed. "She's processing trauma in her own way," Dr. Martinez explained during a checkup visit. "Animals can't talk about their experiences, but they remember them. The important thing is that she still trusts you. That bond hasn't been broken." Indeed, Luna's trust in George seemed stronger than ever. Where once she had maintained the slight independence typical of her species, she now sought his presence more often, sometimes simply sitting near him as he worked on his wildlife journals or prepared educational materials for the school groups that had begun visiting again. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the fields surrounding George's property, the story of Luna's rescue spread beyond their small community. A regional newspaper ran a feature article, followed by interest from wildlife magazines, and even a documentary filmmaker who wanted to highlight the importance of proper wildlife rehabilitation and the dangers of exotic animal trafficking. George, initially reluctant to step into the spotlight, eventually agreed when he realized the platform could help protect other animals from suffering Luna's fate. "I'm just an old farmer who loves animals," he told the filmmaker during an interview conducted in Luna's enclosure, the bobcat lounging regally on a branch above his head. "But if sharing our story helps change how people think about wildlife, then maybe Luna's ordeal served a greater purpose." The documentary, titled The Wildness Within, Luna's Story, premiered at a community event held in the high school gymnasium. The entire town turned out, along with wildlife officials, rehabilitators from neighboring counties, and even a state senator who announced new legislation strengthening penalties for wildlife trafficking. After the screening, George found himself surrounded by well-wishers, including a group of teenagers who had formed a wildlife conservation club inspired by Luna's story. "We want to learn how to help animals properly," their spokesperson, a serious young woman named Amber, explained. "Not just rescue them, but understand when they should remain wild and when they need human intervention. That's the most important lesson," George agreed. "Respecting the wildness in them while acknowledging our responsibility to protect them from the harms we've created." Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and quiet returned to the farm, George sat in his customary spot inside Luna's enclosure. The bobcat drifted down from her favorite perch to settle beside him, allowing him to gently stroke her fur, a privilege she granted to no one else. "We've come a long way, haven't we, little lady?" George mused, watching as fireflies began to blink in the gathering dusk beyond the enclosure. Luna responded with a soft chirp, pressing slightly against his hand. In that peaceful moment, George reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. The tragedy of Luna's orphaning, the joy of their bonding, the terror of her kidnapping and near death, and now this new chapter where their story was helping to protect other vulnerable creatures. "You know," he told Luna confidentially, "Margaret always said everything happens for a reason, even the painful things. I never quite believed her." He paused, watching as Luna's ears twitched attentively at the mention of his late wife's name, a name she had heard many times in George's reminiscences. "But looking at all the good that's come from our worst days, maybe she was onto something. Maybe sometimes it takes nearly losing something precious to remind us all how much it's worth fighting for." Luna yawned widely, displaying impressive fangs before settling her head on her paws. Her golden eyes, now bright and alert again, remained fixed on George with what he could only interpret as affection, wild, untamed affection from a creature that walked the boundary between two worlds. And in that gaze, George found both comfort for the past and hope for the future. A future where humans might learn to better balance their relationship with the wild creatures who shared their world, recognizing that compassion wasn't just a human virtue, but a bridge between species. "Rest easy, little lady," he whispered as Luna's eyes began to close, her breathing deepening with approaching sleep. "Tomorrow's another day for both of us." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, witnesses to an unlikely friendship that had withstood the worst of human cruelty and emerged stronger. A small but significant victory for kindness in a sometimes harsh world.